I think we might go through this every single expansion where the conversation talking about Tyrannical versus Fortified comes up, and people complain about Tyrannical, people complain about how hard the bosses are and stuff like that. And today I kind of want to talk about why Tyrannical is going to be a decent amount harder this season than Fortified is going to be, and kind of talk about some of the things that we're already seeing um, with regards to just what Tyrannical is going to be. I don't want this to necessarily be complaining. I want this to be more just talking about like why it's going to be so hard this season, like relative to what we've seen over the course of Dragonflight. Because I think Dragonflight's been a bit unique in the sense of throughout most of Dragonflight, both Fortified and Tyrannical have been pretty playable. Where in season one, if you look at the top of the leaderboard, there was actually a decent amount of Tyrannical keys. It was mostly heavily Fortified weighted, but at the end of the day, there was some Tyrannical keys, which is normally it's more than we see normally. Last season, I think was the best season that we've ever seen necessarily for Tyrannical, where actually a lot of high end keys were being done on Tyrannical levels. And Tyrannical is such a weird affix. It's one that whenever you were doing weekly normal level keys, Tyrannical is probably the preferred affix over Fortified, where like because you're able to kill the bosses before they necessarily do anything at like weekly key levels, and on top of that, especially once you're like max geared, and on top of that, like the trash, whenever it's Tyrannical trash, just also kind of gets deleted very quickly, and so whenever the bosses don't have that downside of being so incredibly hard, it makes it I would say it makes it a lot easier to not mess up whenever you're doing like weekly level keys. However, once you get into like higher, more coordinated groups, Tyrannical becomes a bit more of a problem because then the bosses start to become more drawn out, right? And this typically, the reason that this typically becomes harder is because the timer then becomes a factor, becomes an issue. But this season, we're actually seeing something that's a little bit of a shift in regards to how timers are across the whole entire season. So if you've actually been playing a decent amount of Mythic Plus this season, you probably noticed that pretty much all of the timers are very lenient. There's Rise, I think is like the timer that is the least lenient by far. But in general, a lot of the timers are very, very lenient, especially for this early on in the season. I think it's very uncommon to see so many timers that are this free. I will say in season one, we have Quarter Stars and Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, which had incredibly generous timers. And so people were two chesting those keys earlier on. This season, Fall, Atal'Dazar, pretty much all of the dungeons, Blackrock Hold even, is able to be two chested at an incredibly high level right now. Obviously, this is very early on in the season, so like you could argue that it's a bit of an overreaction. At the end of the day, though, a lot of these timers are incredibly generous to the point where you can have 15 deaths in a lot of keys, 20 deaths in a lot of keys. I've even seen some really high Blackrock Holds timed with like 25 plus deaths, and that's not something that is super common, even early on in seasons. Um, so you might ask, how does this relate to Tyrannical? The way that they designed dungeons this season is quite interesting relative to how Tyran is going to scale. So in the past couple of seasons, Blizzard has been straying away, I would say, from one-shot style mechanics. Instead, they've been laying in pretty heavily into like group-wide damage and a bunch of ticks. If you think about things like Raging Tempest from Noku, that wasn't necessarily a one-shot. Quarter Star's last boss, that was again just like group-wide damage that had to be healed up over time. The third boss of Halls of Infusion, again, that was just like group-wide damage. And infrequently are they laying into these hard one-shot checks. Now there were still some. If you think about third boss of Nokud with the arrows, that was a one-shot check, especially at high levels. If you think about last boss of Uldaman, that was also a one-shot check at higher levels. But at the end of the day, this season has way more. Oh my gosh, my cat. This season has way more. And so, like, Darkheart Thicket, basically it's a dungeon full of one-shot checks. Oakheart, Dracerons, Roar, Shade of Xavius, Bolt, all one-shot checks. It's going to be difficult to die to much other things in the dungeon. In addition to that, you have bosses like Archmage Soul and the Everbloom, where she does her salvo, Cinderstorm Volley, AoE. And while it's not necessarily a one-shot, it's a bunch of small hits that are going to kill you immediately unless you have a DR. And so it's not like a traditional. I'm not getting like 100 to 0 by a stomp or something like that. But you are going to die basically if you have a DR. It's like non-healable damage is kind of my point, and kind of similar to like Throne of the Tide's first boss. Like you do, I guess maybe Throne of the Tide's first boss is not the best example because you have like a couple of seconds to be able to press health potion in between getting Chain Lightning down, but like again, I think that's just kind of proving that the season is very one shot heavy. Black Cold is like a dungeon full of one shots as well with Amalgam, Smash Bite, and Ravencrest. So like, I think that they actually just designed a bunch of dungeons this season that favor the one shot style mechanic while making the timers incredibly lenient. And this, of course, is going to make Tyrannical a much harder affix set. So it's not necessarily the issue that we've seen in the past where Tyrannical's Tyrannical is just going to be harder because it's going to be harder to time the key. That's not going to necessarily be true. I feel like if anybody's making that argument, that's not like super fair. I think that in general the timers are going to be pretty lenient in most of the keys. But I think that because the timers are going to be lenient in most of the keys, players are going to be doing keys at a much higher level than they should relative to their HP pools because we have an insane amount of damage this season relative to our health pools. And that's not something that you typically have. Now it's certainly an innovative expansion thing, and it's certainly something that's been it happens because of like how they've changed dungeon scaling over time. So now we're getting like 10% scaling per level again. Whenever you so that of course doesn't want you to be doing a 32 level key relative to your health pool. Instead, that wants you to be doing like a 26 or a 27, right? But whenever you have the damage, because item level has gone up so much across the entire expansion, to be able to do these high level keys, I mean, I'm projecting maybe like 32s, but that might even be on the low end. We'll see. But whenever people are going to be able to do like these super, super high level keys, Tyrannical then becomes less of a, oh, we can't time the key because the timer's tight. It's becoming more of like a Fortified is much easier because I'm not going to get one shot by the bosses. And I mean, you've already seen people, if you've been paying attention this season, doing 29s of dungeons. Like a 29 is already being done. And so like, naturally that's going to go up over the course of the entire season. These people aren't necessarily being one shot in these keys yet. But I think this is going to become a problem where Tyrannical is going to severely, severely, severely outscale Fortified. Now, you could probably make a pretty valid argument that this is just a 1% issue, and I think that's probably pretty fair. But at the same point, it's more of a problem at like the end of the day of like how the dungeons are designed, and that this consistently is happening where Fortified and Tyrannical are so imbalanced. I thought that Blizzard did a great job in seasons 1 and 2 of balancing Fortified and Tyrannical, and I'm not exactly sure how they can balance Fortified versus Tyrannical this season just with how they have designed these dungeons. I don't think that this is something as simple as like they go through and they nerf the bosses, because then that's going to reduce the ability to be able to even like wipe to the dungeons, right? And it's going to create even further problems where there's like not much that's deadly in these keys, and I think that creates a whole host of different issues. I mean, another problem this causes, not only just on Tyrannical but on Fortified in regards to dungeon design, is this ends up creating a bit of problems with like the compositions that you're going to start seeing from players, where they're going to favor heavily defensive favored stuff like Augmentation Evoker again, where even if Augmentation Evoker is bad, which I'm not necessarily saying it is, but like even if it would be bad, it's going to just be brought because it makes your group so defensively minded. And I mean, even things like Protection Paladin, I think, is also like a pretty good option, especially whenever bosses are going to start one-shotting you, because they bring things like Diva Aura, they bring Sacrifice, they have the ability, Bop, I guess, but like they have the ability to be able to off-heal your group by a pretty significant amount. And so then that means you play like fully defensive because you know that you're going to have timer on the key. And so then it's just like a really weird dynamic where you're playing, as opposed to trying to time the key, you're playing to avoid getting one shot 100-0. I think it's like, I don't mind one shot checks inside of some of the dungeons. I think that there should be a healthy balance of them. But I think it's a weird dynamic whenever the timers are so incredibly lenient, pretty much straight across the board. And then there's basically nothing stopping you from timing the key except for, am I going to get one shot on this boss? That creates a very weird paradigm and texture for the entire season. But overall, I just wanted to kind of talk about and bring attention to the fact that Tyrannical is going to be a much harder affix this season than it certainly has been in the past, and it certainly has been in the past, this including this expansion. Now, if you look further in the past, like BFA and stuff like that, it's not going to be anywhere similar to BFA or Legion levels of what Tyrannical was, because that was pretty encompassing, where even at like low level keys, Tyrannical was incredibly stupid. But it's certainly going to be much harder than it has been in recent memory. And that's all I want to talk about today. Just kind of wanted to give an opinion piece on some of the stuff that we've been seeing inside of Mythic Plus. I hope to see you guys in the next video, and I hope you guys enjoyed.